Welcome to our video lecture on process flow diagrams. In this lecture, we're going to explore the topic of flowcharts, otherwise known as process flow diagrams, and we're going to learn how to create a basic process flow diagram. So, what are we going to cover in this lesson? Firstly, we're going to look at using a basic list to document the various steps in a process, and we're going to try to understand why using a list is basically inadequate. So we're going to look at the shortcomings of using lists. Then we're going to look at the issue or the concept of logical flow. And logical flow will look at how one step in a process flows to another step, and whether or not that flow is sequential or if there's a different kind of determination for what is the next step in a process. Then we're going to look at process flow diagrams. So we're going to see finally what a process flow diagram is and what it looks like. And then we're going to explore how to create a process flow diagram. But of course, we're going to need to learn the symbols of a process flow diagram. Then we're going to look at one example, and this example is taken straight from your textbook. We're going to look at a second example, and here is where we're going to learn step by step how we're going to go about not just creating a process flow diagram, but also how you read and understand a process flow diagram. Of course, using the standard process for creating a process flow diagram, there are some limitations, and there's one limitation in particular that we're going to discuss. And then we're going to look at our third example, and we're going to use a different kind of process flow diagram, slightly different. It's called the swim lane process, and we're going to see how that differs from our standard process flow diagram. We're going to look at what are the key advantages of using the swim lane method. And lastly, we're going to do a live demo. I'm going to switch across to my browser, and I'm going to use Google Docs, and I'm going to teach you how to use Google Docs to create your own process flow diagram, whether you're going to do your diagram as an individual or you're going to work as a group, because of course Google Docs facilitates collaboration. And that's it. So this is not going to be a fairly long lecture, but it is going to cover all of the basics. So let's begin. Now, if someone were to ask you to create a write-up of a procedure, whether that procedure is registration or applying to CUSTAT as a student, or the procedure for how your company recruits employees or recruits customers, what would you do? How will that process look if you were to document it? The typical individual who would not have been introduced and demoed on how to create process flows using a diagram would very likely use a list, a simple list. And let's create one list here, and we're going to see how that list works or does not work for the purpose of documenting a step-by-step process. So in this example, we're going to use CUSTAT's procedure for when a student applies to become a student and is eventually getting to the point where that student can now register for the very first time for their classes. It's a very simple procedure, and it has been simplified even more for the sake of this example. So, step one, the prospective student fills out an online application form, and I think everybody could agree to that step. Step two, that application is reviewed and ultimately approved by some member of staff in CUSTAT. Step three, the student is interviewed by their academic department, by somebody in that department, the chair or a member of staff. 4, the prospective student is then required to sit a placement exam. Once that exam is passed and student moves on, the student needs to attend academic advising. Students also need to consult the developmental advisor, particularly students who might be in the need for some assistance, or they may be lacking certain qualifications, or they may even have some, past semesters where they underperformed. And lastly, of course, the student can register for their classes. So this is a very simple list. Now, some of these steps might be new to you. You may be unfamiliar with some of these steps because it may not have been relevant for you in your department. But there are students who have to go through each of these steps. So let's take a closer look at this list of steps in a process and see why a list falls short. So here we go. In a written list, as this is, one assumes that the process follows in a pretty basic sequential order. That is, step 1 leads to step 2, step 2 leads to step 3, step 3 leads to step 4, step 4 leads to 5, 5 to 6, and 6 to 7. That's what that list communicates. The problem with a list written like this is that it does not reflect the reality of what actually happens in the organization. For example, if the prospective student in step 1 misses certain information in the application form, they've left it out, or they may have included erroneous information, and that omission or error is picked up by the member of staff who is reviewing the application. That member staff may actually send the application back to the prospective student for the student to be able to submit or include that which was left out before. So right there we see a deviation from the sequential order of the execution of this process. So we see that there is some alternative flow of the way this process is executed that a list does not capture. Simply writing down the steps will not inform anyone that there is a deviation from what is understood to be in a written list a sequential order. But that's not the only kind of alternative or alteration to the sequential flow. For example, many of you may not have had to engage in fact, none of you, since you're not nursing students, would have had to engage in a student interview where you would have been interviewed before being accepted into the institution. So for you, you would have gone straight from step 2 to step 4. But nursing students cannot miss that step. So for them, they have to engage in the interview. So that's an important step for them. They must engage in their interview. But for you, as a business major, you would skip from step 2 to step 4. Once again, that logical flow of the sequence of events in the actual process is different from what is written on a simple list. But that's not the only skip that may take place. For example, a student who may have A-levels or who may have already done a degree at another institution, may have done an associate degree maybe at Roy Tech or maybe even at Custard some years before, they would not have to do a placement exam. So for such students, in addition to not having to do step 3, they can also skip step 4. So here we see that this list again is not a true representation of what actually takes place on the ground in the organization. And that is, of course, the simple truth of why lists cannot truly represent a process, because what actually happens is often different from what is written on a simple list. We have one more. How about this? Most students do not need to meet with and be advised by the developmental advisor. The developmental advisor's role serves a certain group of students, and as such, it is likely that most students will have to skip step 6, which is a good thing, by the way. So you go straight from step 5 to step 7. So there we have it. If we use a list to represent an actual organizational or business process, we see that how that listing, written in a sequential manner, very often will not accurately represent what takes place. So we do have some shortcomings. Let's summarize them. Well, firstly, lists are sequential in nature and do not demonstrate the actual logical flow of a process. Now, I've used that term before, logical flow, and I'm highlighting it here because it is something that we are going to have to understand before we move on to actually looking at a process flow diagram. Lists do not allow for sequence that flows upward, which we saw. Lists do not allow for sequence that skips one or more steps, which we also saw. Lists do not account for conditional execution of steps, that is, steps that will be executed only if certain conditions are true. So for example, a student will have to be interviewed only if they are a nursing student. If they are not a nursing student, then they will not need to be interviewed. So there we go, that's a condition. And finally, lists make the process of training employees about how to perform a process or a procedure difficult because they make the process appear more simplistic than it may actually be. So again, as you saw the original list, it looked like a very simple list. In reality, things are a little bit more complex. Not necessarily difficult, but complex. So let's talk about logical flow. Logical flow refers to the actual sequence of the process as one step moves to a different step, not necessarily to the next step, but to a different step. So there are 3 basic types of logical flow. Now there are more types of logical flow, more patterns of logical flow, but there are 3 basic types, and these are the 3 that you need to know. Firstly, we have something called simple sequence. Simple sequence occurs when the process moves from one step to the step that immediately follows, and it's illustrated by a straight arrow, whichever direction the arrow is pointing, but it goes basically from step 1 to step 2, step 2 to step 3, step 3 to step 4. So simple sequence means it goes to the very next step. It's not skipping anything, it's not going back, it is simply going to the very next step. Next, we have a loop. A loop occurs when the process moves from a later step to a previous step, or an earlier step as the case may be. This is illustrated by an arrow that loops backward or loops upward to a previous step. In the example we had used before, we had looped back from step 2 to step 1. Now, you may ask, why is this a loop? A loop would be considered to be a complete circle. Well, that's because after the error is fixed in step 1, it now goes back from step 1 to step 2. So it has gone from 1 to 2, 2 back to 1, and now it's going to go back from 1 to 2. And if everything is fine, you can now move on to step 3, step 4, step 5. So a loop allows the process to deviate from that simple sequence and to move backward to a previous step. And the third logical flow pattern is called a branch. Now, a branch occurs when a choice has to be made with regards to what the next step in the process will be. A choice typically results from a condition, some sort of rule that has to be applied that says if. Okay, and it is typically illustrated by an arrow that splits into two arrows pointing in two directions or going to two different steps. So in this example, we have if a prospective student is a nursing student, and notice the word if is highlighted. If the prospective student is a nursing student, step 2 will flow to step 3. So we have step 2 flowing to step 3. And that is they do their student interview. For all other students, step 2 flows to step 4. So it goes from 2 to 4. So when we illustrate our process flow, we need to illustrate when this deviation or this branching out occurs, where we can now direct some students in one direction to a special step, and we direct other students in another direction to their appropriate step, as the case might be. So let's get to the meat of it. A process flow diagram. So what is a process flow diagram? Now, it goes by multiple names. A process flow diagram, also known as a process flow drawing and simply a flowchart, is a type of illustration that represents the logical flow of the steps in a process, or a workflow, or a procedure. These drawings are made up of a series of labeled symbols and arrows, which show how processes function as they move from one step to another step to another step. Process flow diagrams can also illustrate an entire system, such as an information system, which is why we're covering it for this course. Properly done, a single drawing can represent every possible scenario that a process is designed to capture. With a list, we couldn't do that. A list was fixed. It didn't show what really takes place. But a single drawing, one process flow diagram, can actually capture every variation to what happens in a process. Every different kind of person who enters into this process, every single kind of problem, every single kind of eventuality. One drawing captures all of that. And it's actually not difficult to do, and it's not difficult to understand. In fact, it says here that process flow diagrams are also very easy to read and very easy to understand. Reading a process flow diagram is as simple as following the arrows to the various symbols. And when you see it, which you will see in a few minutes, you will be able to understand how really easy it is to read and then, of course, to create a process flow diagram. But before we can actually look at the diagram, we need to understand a few key things, namely the symbols themselves. So let us look at the most commonly used process flow symbols. And I separated these out because these are all that you need to know for your assignment. And yes, you will have an assignment. These are all that you need. Now, you are free to use additional symbols, and there are many more, and I'll provide you with more in a different format, probably as a PDF document. But really and truly, these four are all you're going to need for your assignment. So let's go. The first is what we call a terminator symbol. And that is basically a symbol that shows where the process flow begins or where the process flow ends. And it is simply the shape of a capsule. And here we go. It just looks like a capsule. By the way, all symbols are labeled. Now, these are just examples here, so I don't have them labeled, but you will see what they look like when they're labeled in a little bit. Next, we have the data symbol. Now, the data symbol is represented by a parallelogram. Okay? The data symbol is a multi-use symbol. That is, it is used to capture the input of data That is when someone is writing things down or when they're putting it into a computer, the capture of data, but it is also used for the output of information or, well, data as the case may be. Let's say, for instance, you are seeing some sort of information on your computer screen, or you are getting a printout on paper from your printer. So data symbol is a multi-use. If you're confused as to what symbol to use for the movement of data, just use this and it will solve all problems. You will be correct. Now there are specific symbols for input and output, but you can use this and you'll be just as correct and you will get full marks for using this symbol. Then we have the process symbol. The process symbol is a simple rectangle or square. Now it's a rectangle or square depending upon how much text you're going to put inside of it. Now this symbol represents an entire sub-process or an entire process. Now bearing in mind that your entire drawing is a process, okay? Because we are looking at a process flow diagram. So if your entire drawing with all of these symbols combined is a process, then how could this one symbol also be a whole process? Well, think about it like your smartphone. You know, on your smartphone, if you can pinch to zoom on a photo and you can actually zoom into the details of a photo and you can squeeze again or pinch again and you can zoom back out. Look at it that way. Imagine being able to pinch to zoom on this symbol virtually. What you will see if you were to zoom in on this symbol would technically be a whole other process. So that whole other sub-process is basically summarized into a single symbol. And I will illustrate that for you in a few minutes when we get to our demonstration of what an actual process flow diagram looks like. The last symbol that you need to know is called the decision symbol. Now this is the most important symbol of all in the sense that it is the decision symbol that allows that variation of the logical flow from a simple sequence to anything else. It is the decision symbol that allows you to loop back to the beginning or to an earlier step. It is the decision symbols that allows you to branch between nursing students and other students. So the decision symbol is a very important symbol. And of course, once it is appropriately labeled, usually in the form of a question, you have only two options, and that is yes or no. Always two. If you have more than two conditions or more than two outcomes, then you need more than one diamond. Because each diamond can only have two arrows leaving it. As a matter of fact, the diamond is the only symbol in process flow drawings that allows more than one arrow to exit the symbol. So as you can see, here we have one arrow leaving, here we have one arrow leaving, here we have one arrow leaving. But with the diamond, as we enter into it, we have two arrows leaving. It is the only symbol that allows for two arrows to leave. And it is only two. It is never one, it is never three. It is always and only two arrows. Bear that in mind. I can't tell you how many students I have expressed this to, but yet in their drawings, they had diamonds that had only one arrow leaving, or they had diamonds with three arrows leaving. And some of those arrows were not even labeled. Obviously, they lost points, which I am hoping that you won't. So let's move on. In addition to these four most commonly used and the most critical symbols, we do have some additional symbols that you may at least want to know about, one of which you will very likely have to use in your assignment. So here we go. The first is the database symbol, and it is a simple cylinder or cylindrical shaped symbol. Now, the database symbol is used to represent the retrieval of data from a database, as well as the storage of data into the database. So one symbol allows for the access to that database. Now, the database could be really a hard drive, it could be a computer system, none of those things matter. What you're documenting here is the process. So you're not actually documenting the details of what kind of hardware. You know, you have how many computers and how many laptops and how many smartphones and tablets and what software. We're not dealing with any of those things in our process flow. All we are dealing with, very simply, is access to the database where we can store our data or we can retrieve our data. Next, for those of you who do not want to use the parallelogram, here we have the manual input symbol, sometimes called the keyboard symbol. And this is used to show how data is captured or inputted into a process using a computer keyboard. So this symbol can be used instead of the data symbol. Remember, but this is purely for input only. Okay, remember the data symbol is for both input and output. This one is input only. Next, we have the document symbol. The document symbol is used to show the output of information from a process. Well, obviously in the form of a document. This symbol can be used instead of the data symbol, but again, only for the output procedure. Remember, the data symbol is used for both input and output. Either one is right. You're not going to lose any marks. But you can potentially lose marks with the manual input or the document symbol if you use the wrong one in the wrong situation. Okay, because the manual input is purely for input and the document is purely for output. Now, lastly, and I'm pretty sure none of you are going to need this one, we have the connector symbol. The connector symbol is used if your drawing, your process flow diagram, is so large that you're going to need more than one sheet of paper to put it on. And that actually does happen. As a matter of fact, we can have process flow drawings that can take up dozens of pages. That's how complex these processes go. Don't worry, you're not going to deal with those. So, on the first page, on page 1 of the drawing, you will actually move your drawing, the sequence of the steps in your drawing, the symbols, to one of these connector symbols, and you're going to label it A. On the next page, where you're going to restart your drawing and you're going to continue from that point, you begin with another connector symbol and you're going to label it A as well. So the two A's match. So you know that where you left off at A on page 1, you resume at A on page 2. Right, I hope that makes sense. Okay, it's basically you can match. You know, obviously the reason why you can put A is because you can put B, C, D, E, F, G, depending upon how many parts of the process meet the end of a page and has to move to its own second or third or fourth page. Again, you're going to match B to B, C to C, D to D, as the case might be. So they always come in matching pairs. So now that we have looked at the symbols, the relevant symbols in our process flow diagrams, let us look at 3 examples of what a process flow diagram looks like. Now, of course, there's an informal way of doing process flow diagrams, and that's the one that you're going to look at first. This informal drawing is taken straight from your textbook. And here we go. Do you remember we discussed in class the example of 2 different bike rental businesses? One was based at a university and one was based at a hotel. And of course, the hotel system, the hotel bike rental business, the resort hotel bike rental business was designed to be extremely efficient at creating an extremely good experience for the customer in an attempt to win them back for the next day and the next day and the next day. Now, I had asked you to take very careful note of that process flow diagram on page 79. However, it is possible that your e-textbook may not actually have this illustration in it. So I'm including it here so that you can actually get a proper look at this diagram. And the reason why I'm including it, it's because this diagram has something special in it that you will need to pay attention to for your assignment. Specifically, it has the use of the database. Okay, so we have different databases. All right, and notice with the database, at one point it is to check out a bike, and the next one is to check in a bike for when the bike comes back in. So the same database is being used for when a bike comes out of inventory, as well as when the bike goes back into inventory. So I'm not going to spend time looking at this particular drawing. You are going to get a copy of this, so you will be able to take your time and understand the process. But of course, notice that other than the database symbol, none of the symbols match the standards that I showed you earlier. And that's because this is an informal process flow diagram. This was used purely for illustrative purposes, and it was not designed to conform to the standards of process flow drawing. It's basically an illustration. It looks good in a textbook, in other words. So they used a lot of character type illustrations. They used bikes and other things, money bag. This was just purely for illustration in a textbook, but it is a process flow. And it begins here with the greeting of the customer, and it goes through. I will leave you to read this on your own, so let's move on. The next example, of course, is the one I need you to look at, to the point where I am going to reveal it to you stage by stage, step by step, so that we can both learn what a process flow looks like, and you're going to learn how to read, interpret, and understand a process flow diagram. So let's go. So here we go. In our example here, we are going to look at a simplified human resources recruitment process. The process involved in recruiting a worker, a workman, some employee. All right, so it begins with the start. Notice the symbol is a capsule. Remember we looked at the 4 important types of symbols? Well, that's it. It begins with a start. Very simple. And notice the labeling inside of the symbol. We have our arrow that leads us to our first actual step. Now, this is not really a step. This is just letting you know where to begin reading the drawing. So let's go. So, in our first step, a potential employee, an applicant, will fill out and submit the application form. Some businesses do have application forms for employment. And of course, they have to submit their various forms of evidence of their qualifications. So if they have a certificate, if they have a diploma, if they have some documentation that says, hey, this person has undergone a certain amount of training and experience, you need to submit that. Okay, that's the first step. Let's move on. Next, the submitted application form, as well as the submitted forms of evidence of qualifications, has to be reviewed by someone at the company. Typically, it's going to be reviewed by an HR assistant, some low-level person in HR. Now, let's back up to the first step. Notice that the shape of this process is a parallelogram. Why is it a parallelogram? Because it is the submission or the filling out of data in an application form. So it is the capture of data. So we use this particular symbol. In the review of that data and of the person's evidence of qualifications, we use the process symbol. Now this is a process. Whoever that HR person is, that HR assistant, they have to be trained in terms of what they need to do to review the submissions from applicants. So there will be a series of steps that they have to take. So if we were to zoom into this, you would notice that hey, there are other steps involved. But for now, that's not really important to us. We don't need to know what those steps are right now. All we need for this process, which is the overall recruitment process, is that a review has to take place. And when that review is taking place, the HR person would annotate, they would highlight certain things, they would observe whether or not everything was okay, or if everything is not okay with the submission, which takes us to the next step. And here we have our first decision. So the question is the application form acceptable? Now, what does this mean? Did the applicant fill out everything? What if the applicant left out something important, such as an emergency contact? If they get injured on the job, if they fall sick on the job, who can they contact to inform of the person's, status? Or it may require some other information that was not included, in which case the question has to be asked. Is the application form that was received and submitted and received, is it acceptable? If something was left out, then the answer is no, it is not acceptable. At which case, the process flows back to the top, where the form is returned to the applicant, and the applicant has to now fill in the missing data. At which point in time, it will be handed back to the HR assistant, who will then review it a second time. Again, has to ask that question: is the application form acceptable? This time, if the answer is yes, great, we can now move on to the next step. So we now ask another question: are the required qualifications evidence sufficient? In other words, did the person provide sufficient forms of evidence of their qualifications? If the answer is no, then again we return back to the top, where the person now has to go, you have to go home and you have to apply to your school to get a copy of your diploma or a copy of your transcript. Don't just tell us that you have good grades. We need to see that transcript. So, are the required qualifications evidence sufficient? If the answer is no, go back to the top. If the answer is yes, we can now move on to the next step. We have one more question to answer here. Does the applicant meet all of the employment criteria? Well, the form was properly filled out, they've submitted all of their evidence, but is the person now suitable to be employed? What if we are looking to hire an electrician and the person's employment qualification says that they're a plumber and they understand everything to do with plumbing, but we don't need a plumber, we need an electrician? Does the applicant meet all employment criteria despite having submitted everything that they were supposed to submit? The answer is no. In which case, the process moves to where we reject them, and it will be nice to say that we can reject somebody in writing, but it could be verbally, and well, in Trinidad, you may not have any rejection at all, you just don't hear from them again. At which point in time, once the applicant is rejected, the process goes to the end. And notice the end is the same symbol at the start, I just color them differently. And this is where the process ends. That's it, done. We finish with this applicant. Another applicant comes in and goes through the same process. It's the Application form acceptable? Yes. All the evidence of qualification submitted? Yes. Does the applicant meet all of the employment criteria? And if the answer this time is yes, well, we now go through another process. Now, we have to assume that more than one person will apply for the job, and more than one person would in fact be qualified to be employed. They would meet the criteria. So what we do now, we now go through a process of elimination. If 100 people applied for this position and we only have one available position, we can't hire all 100. So we now have to go through several processes where we begin to massage that number from 100 applicants all the way down to one final person who we hope will, get the job. So we go through a comparison process, and that's a process. Notice the shape of this symbol. It's a process. How are they going to go through this comparison? I don't know. We're not going to get into those details. But if we were to get into those details, it's a matter of pinching to zoom on this symbol here. And as we zoom in, we see a whole other process flow with all of these shapes specific to the comparison of one applicant to another applicant to another applicant, where we now eliminate some persons. For example, if everybody is qualified and we ask that everybody has minimum 5 years, that's something that everybody have, 5 years experience. And of course, everybody does have 5 years experience, but some persons have 9 years, some persons have 12 years, some persons have 13 years experience. If they have 13 years experience or 11 years or 9 years experience, we may prefer them over the persons who have 5 years or 6 years, because simply put, that person is more experienced, in which case we go to the next step. Do we shortlist the applicant for an interview? So the persons who may have only 5 or 6 years, even though that's what we asked for, but we now have so many people who applied, we have to find a way to eliminate some. So we decide, okay, for applicant A, do we shortlist? This person has 5 years experience. We did ask for 5 years. Do we shortlist? The answer is no. Why? Because we have other people who are more experienced. We cannot potentially or possibly interview everybody. So we have to find a way to minimize this list. So some persons will in fact be rejected, even though they have all of the criteria. They meet every possible criteria. They can get the job done. But we still have to eliminate some of them. Obviously, if some are eliminated, then some will be accepted. So we go to the next step. And the next step is we notify the applicant of an interview date. Now, I could have used a parallelogram for this step. Why? Because it's information. You are informing someone of the interview date. So yes, I could have used a parallelogram and that would have been 100% correct. So why didn't I? Why didn't I use a parallelogram? The answer is because notifying not just one applicant, but all of the applicants who were shortlisted is a process that involves informing them. But it's not just letting them know that they're going to be interviewed. That date for the interview has to be determined. And it's not just looking at a calendar and picking a date. Why? Because the panel of people who are going to interview the recruits or the potential recruits, they all have their jobs, their regular, day-to-day jobs. So they all have different schedules. So to get a date where they can all make themselves available may not be as simple as just calling a date. Persons have to agree. And if someone says, no, I cannot make that date, then that date doesn't work. So it's a process. We're not going to get into the details of that process. So we're just going to simply, for now, just put one symbol. And that's the beauty of the process symbol. Without having to get into the details of what the real process is, we can refer to a sub-process by simply using one symbol and then moving on. And that's important because I need you to do that for your final assignment. Okay, bear that in mind. There are some things that I don't need you to document, for which you just simply use one symbol. So they know of the interview date. What's next? Well, we have to conduct the interview. And that's also a process. An interview is a process. A number of questions have to be asked. A number of key indicators are being looked at in terms of what each candidate demonstrates in the interview. And a judgment has to be made. A decision has to be made. And for each candidate who is interviewed, there is a question that is being asked. The question is the applicant the best candidate? And every single person who's interviewed, you have to ask this question: is this the best candidate? For everyone but one, the answer is going to be no. Is this the best candidate? No. At which point in time, we reject that person. If the answer is yes, for that one lucky person, if the answer is yes, we then move on to the next step, which is we issue an offer of employment to the candidate. Now again, I used the process symbol as opposed to simply using, the parallelogram symbol. Why did I not use a parallelogram? Because it's an offer, it's a letter. You're going to issue a letter, right? Well, there's more to it than that. What if during the interview, the applicant who is best indicated that their current salary is $8,000, but the company's plan was to pay this person $6,000? That's the budget that the company allocated for this new electrician, $6,000 a month. But this person is so good and so impressed everybody that you want to bring this person on. But you cannot offer him less than what he's making right now. You cannot offer the man $6,000 and ask him to leave his $8,000 a month job. So you have to go through a process of determining, really, can we really afford this person? Can we really give this person a salary of $8,000, $8,500, maybe $9,000? That has to be determined. And maybe the decision is made that, okay, fine, we will offer this person $9,000, but because we're paying this person so much compared to what we plan to pay them, that we need to now increase the number of duties that this person will perform, simply because we're paying them so much. Again, that's a whole process, and we're not going to get into those details in our drawing. So we're going to summarize it all into one symbol, and we're going to move on. So that is, we're going to offer this person employment opportunity. We now move to the next step, which is the applicant who was interviewed, he or she must now make a decision. Do I accept the offer of employment? Now, most persons who apply for a job, it's understood that they are probably going to be applying for many jobs all over the place. And the person may have gotten 2 or 3 or 4 offers. So now he has to decide, hey, do I accept this offer? If the answer is no, he got a better offer somewhere else, well, reject the offer in writing. And it's a simple matter of writing a letter. Hence, it is a parallelogram. Okay? So, do I accept the offer of employment? The answer is no. Reject the offer in writing, and we take it to the end. That's it. End of the process. End of everything. We move on to the next person. However, if the answer is yes, and the guy is going to accept the offer, we move on to the final step, which is to fill out and submit all of the employment requirements. Now, these may be things that may not have been included in the application form. For example, the person's NIS information, the person's bank account information, so that salary can go into the person's bank account. Things like that. All right, so here we have it. This is a process flow diagram. It looks complicated at first glance, but as you begin to read it, you begin to see how simple it is. And it captures every possible scenario. It captures whether they filled out the information correct, and whether it has to go back to the beginning, whether they submitted all of the evidence of qualifications. If not, it goes back to the beginning. If not, you move on. Is this person to be, doesn't meet all the criteria? If not, reject. Yes, they are qualified. Then we compare them to everybody else. Do we shortlist? If the answer is no, we reject. If the answer is yes, we notify of an appointment for the interview. We conduct the interview, and the decision is made. Is the candidate the best candidate? No, we reject. Is the candidate the best candidate? Yes, and we issue an offer of employment. Once we do that, the person now has to make that determination. Do I accept the offer of employment? If no, the applicant rejects. If yes, then of course the applicant fills out whatever additional information, and there may be other steps that I've left out, but you get the idea. This is a process flow drawing, and you will now have to create your own process flow drawing. Now, before we get into that detail, this is the standard method. There's nothing wrong with this, generally speaking, except there's one issue. There's one limitation. As easy as this is to read, as easy as it is to understand what's going on, as easy as it is to understand what each step is, what kind of process it is, whether it is, or what kind of task it is, whether it is an input or output, whether it is a sub-process or decision. And that one problem is that it does not show you who in the company is responsible for which of these tasks. Now, each task is assigned to somebody, the applicant, an HR assistant, or somebody else in the company. This does not show you that information. So that brings us to this. The limitation of the standard method is that it does not show who is responsible for carrying out which step in the process, which tasks. As such, we move to another style of doing our process flows. And it's not much different. It's very similar, but there is a big difference, and that is, this is the swim lane method. The swim lane method of process flow diagram resolves this important limitation of the standard method. With the swim lane method, separate columns or lanes are created for each role that will be involved in the execution of the process. So in the previous illustration, it's difficult to tell how many persons or how many different roles are involved in this. But in the swim lane method, we know at a glance how many roles are involved. So each symbol in the process flow diagram will be placed in its relevant lane or its relevant column, so that each person will know what their duties or their tasks are relevant to the whole process. So we're going to take each of these symbols. We're not creating a new drawing. We're going to take this drawing and we're going to rearrange it. We're just going to grab one of these symbols and move it around. And you're going to see how easy that is with the right software. Okay? So, what does the swim lane method look like? Here we go. This is the identical process, literally the identical process. Every single step is the same. The same symbol, the same wording, the same arrows in terms of where the arrow goes to which symbol. The difference here is that the symbols have been now located in an appropriate lane. So we have 4 roles. We have the applicant, who has the applicant's roles. We have the HR assistant, who has their duties to do. We have a senior HR person, likely the HR manager, who has her duties to perform. And then we have the interview panel. Now, the interview panel is obviously not one person, it's an actual group of persons, but it's a single role. So here we could have it, 4 roles, and we take all of the various processes that we had before, and all we do is just rearrange them. The arrows will naturally move on their own, the arrows will follow where the symbols go. With the right software, as you move a symbol, the arrow follows. It's really beautiful, it's really easy to do. So we just simply take the symbol and we just move it around, put them in the appropriate column. So now we know these are the HR assistant's duties. These are the HR manager's duties. These are the interview panel's duties. And these are the different tasks that the applicant has to now do. I'm not going to go through reading this because it's literally the identical process. It's just arranged differently. So obviously we're going to have some lines that are crossing each other. So you can actually see here, for example, how one line crosses another line because of how things move from one column to the next, one lane to the next. But it is still just as readable. And from my experience, I have found that putting lines in different colors often helps in keeping the overall process flow readable. Now I have 3 different color lines. I have black, red, and blue. Same as I did in our previous drawing. So even here, I had black, red, and blue. All are the same, except we've relocated things around. So this is a swim lane method. What are the advantages of the swim lane method? Well, each participant in the process is able to focus on their own tasks so that they do not have to be distracted with learning or understanding the entire process. So we can train the HR assistant to do what the HR assistant has to do, and that person doesn't have to know what the whole process is. They just need to know what their tasks are. Training manuals can be easily created for specific employees that will contain only the tasks that they need to know and learn. It is also easier to identify how many persons or roles are required by the business to ensure the proper execution of the process. And lastly, it is easier to enhance, modify, or improve a process by identifying which steps or tasks that are performed by which roles can be changed or removed, or moved around, as the case might be. So we have a number of advantages. As you may guess, the assignment that you are going to have to do, you will have to use the swim lane method only. It is the only method that you are going to be required to use. If you do not use the swim lane method, you will obviously lose points. So that's the end of the formal part of the lecture. But now we move to a live demo. I'm going to show you how you can use Google Docs to create your own swim lanes process flow diagrams. I'm going to do it from scratch. So let's switch across to my browser and let's use Google Docs and let's see how we can create a process flow diagram using Google Docs, and specifically the slides or presentation feature of Google Docs. So here we go. Here we are, Google Docs. You are familiar with this screen setup. We go to the hamburger menu. That's the menu beside here. And we choose Slides. So here we are in Google Slides. It's the easiest one to use to do this. So we start a new presentation. We click on the plus. We're going to create a blank presentation. Now, of course, it's a presentation like PowerPoint, so you can actually have multiple slides or pages if you prefer, which are important for you because you are going to have to create 2 drawings. You or your group will have to create 2 drawings, so you just insert another slide and you move on. What we really want here is a blank slide, right? Now, of course, you're going to have a cover page. I'm not going to deal with all those details. So I am going to remove these elements. So we now have a completely blank slide or blank page. And what I am going to do, I am going to insert a table. and I'm going to put 4 columns and 2 rows. Now, you will put as many columns as you need, but it'll always be 2 rows. So, here we have the table. I'm just going to arrange this table to occupy a little bit more space, and you're going to see why in a bit. And lastly, I'm going to expand this second row like that. So here we have 4 columns, and that's it. We have our swim lane. As simple as that. We can put the roll, okay, as simple as that. Format it as you need to format it. And now it is time for the symbols. So we're going to start it. We have the shape option here. Click. We're going to choose shape. And here we have a number of shapes. We're going to choose the terminator. It even labels it for you. And we're going to draw our first symbol. Of course, you can double click it and you can put whatever you want inside there. That's fine, you label it. Next, we put our second symbol. So again, we go back to shapes and we're going to choose parallelogram. Now, of course, up here it calls it a parallelogram, but down here it calls it data. Sound and look familiar? So now we're going to put our parallelogram. We size it as we need to. We can rearrange it. And by the way, that red line that shows up as we rearrange it lets you know that it's now centered with the one above. So it's now perfectly centered. Let's put another symbol. And this time we're going to put the symbol here for roll 2. So we go back to shape and we're going to put the rectangle. And we're going to put the rectangle. This is, of course, our process representing a sub-process. So we now have 3 symbols. We need to link these symbols. Okay? So I'm going to select this one. I don't need to select it, but I'm selecting it. And we can choose the line feature. Click the drop arrow, and we're going to choose arrow. And we're going to simply, now that we chose arrow, these turn purple, and it means that we can now draw our arrow and we can connect it. It's as simple as that. So we now have one arrow. Let's do another one. Coming to this one here, and I'm going to connect it to this one. Boom, just like that. It's very simple. Now, obviously, a diagonal arrow really doesn't look very attractive. We can change this. So all I do is select the arrow, I right click, and I change the connector from a straight connector to, we have 2 options, 2 other options. First we have the elbow connector. So there we go. So we now have an elbow shape. If we wanted something a little bit more aesthetic, although I prefer the elbow shape, we right click again, we change the connector, and we're going to choose curved connector. So now we have a curved connector. As simple as that. By the way, if we move the shape, the connector moves as well. So if we decide to put this here, the connector moves. And by the way, we can take this and we can relocate it here. We can take the arrow, holding the purple dot, and I can move it here. And there we go. It's as simple as that. And if I want to put it back, I put it over here, and then I simply hold the arrow and I reconnect at the most convenient locations. Or I can move this all the way across here. So the arrow follows wherever the shape goes. By the way, that red line lets you know that it's aligned to the top, so it's now equally aligned and evenly aligned at the top. What about a diamond, a decision? Well, let's do that now. So we're going to set another symbol and we're going to insert a decision. Now we have the diamond here, or we have a decision flowchart. They may look different, but trust me, they are identical. It's the same shape. Okay, so we choose that and let's draw our diamond. Okay, so now we draw our arrow to connect to that diamond. Let's relocate this so everything is lining up perfectly. Notice the red line that showed up. And now coming from this, we can now draw two more arrows. Let's say one that goes across here that connects. Let's move this back down here and let's change this to an elbow connector. And now let's do another symbol over here for row 3. And we're going to draw our arrow from here to here. And again, we're going to change this to our elbow connector. Now, if you don't like how that elbow connector is shaped, we can always relocate it. Oh, I think the problem is I didn't connect it properly. There you go. It's now connected to our dot. Alright, so that's it. Now, this drawing looks pretty boring. Feel free to enhance your drawing however you want. For example, if I select this line, I can now change the color of the line to red. And I can select each one and I press Ctrl Y on your keyboard and it repeats the formatting. Ctrl Y, Ctrl Y, Ctrl Y. So we now have red connectors. You can also change the color of our symbol. Let's change this to a pale color and we're going to change this to a purplish color. As well as we can change our lanes. So the fill in this lane, let's use orange. And here we're going to choose a light shade of orange. Here we're going to put it as blue. And here we're going to put a light shade of blue. You get the idea. Feel free to format these as you wish. I'm going to put this as white. And of course, you type and you label it however you want. So there you go. Creating a swim lanes process flow diagram using Google Docs where your group can share, you can collaborate, you can work in it together. It's really, really simple. This is the preferred method that I would want you to use to create your assignment. Of course, you're going to have 2 drawings, so when you finish with this one, you insert another slide, so you have 2 pages or 2 slides, and you create the second one. It's as simple as that. Format it however you choose to format it, whatever your group chooses in terms of how it looks best for you. Okay? It's as simple as that. So that's it. That's our live demo. And that's our video lecture. So I hope this lecture made sense. I will be sending you an email that contains links to other YouTube videos that again show how to create process flow diagrams, drawings, flowcharts, and that will give you additional information related to the assignment as well as the assignment itself. I am going to give you the choice, as will be stated in my email, of whether you want to work alone in light of the lockdown status, or if you are still willing to work with your group. So look out for my email. That's it. Well, this is our only video lecture for this semester, so I hope it was useful to you. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.